The morning sun had not yet burned away the dew when Samuel Thorne first saw the blood. It marked the earth in dark, irregular patches that led away from the creek bed where he'd brought his father's sheep to drink. The boy stood motionless among the bleeding animals, his bare feet planted in the soft mud, watching the crimson trail wind through the sagebrush like a broken prayer written in the desert's own hand. At 13, he had seen enough death to recognize its signature. The jackrabbits that fell to his father's rifle, the stillborn lambs that came too early in the harsh spring, the way life leaked out of things and left only silence behind. But this was different. This blood spoke of something larger, something that had crawled through the night carrying its wounds like a burden too heavy for one man to bear. Samuel counted the drops, measured their spacing with his shepherd's eye, and understood that whatever had passed this way was moving slowly, deliberately, with the careful gait of something that knew its time was short, but refused to surrender to the desert's hunger. The sheep pressed around him, their woolly bodies warm against his legs, but he barely felt their presence. His attention had narrowed to that dark trail, to the story it told of suffering and determination written across the morning landscape. He followed the blood, not out of curiosity, though that lived in him as it did in all boys, but from something deeper, something that had grown in the hollow spaces of his chest during the 3 years since his mother had disappeared into the endless expanse of Apache territory. His father claimed she was dead, spoke of her in past tense with the flat certainty of a man who had buried his hope alongside his faith. But Samuel had never seen her body, never touched the cold flesh that would have made her absence final. In the deep places of his heart, in the chambers where a boy keeps his most desperate wishes, he held on to the possibility that she might still draw breath somewhere beyond the horizon. The trail led him up a shallow rise where the morning light struck the red rocks and turned them into glowing coals. Here the blood was fresher, still dark with moisture, and Samuel's pulse quickened as he crested the hill and saw the figure crumpled in the shadow of a weathered boulder. The man wore the blue uniform of the cavalry, though it was torn and stained beyond recognition. His horse lay 20 yards away, its neck bent at an impossible angle, its eyes already clouded with death. But the man still moved, his chest rising and falling with the labored rhythm of someone clinging to life by will alone. Samuel approached slowly, his bare feet silent on the stone. The soldier was older than his father, perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved around his eyes by years of squinting into the sun. Blood seeped from wounds in his shoulder and thigh, but it was the way he breathed that told Samuel the real damage was inside, where the body's secrets dwelt hidden from view. The boy knelt beside him, close enough to smell the copper scent of blood and the bitter sage that grew in the crevices of the rocks. "Easy now," Samuel whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the man or to himself. His voice carried the soft cadence he used with injured animals, the tone that promised safety without demanding trust. The soldier's eyes opened, gray as winter sky, and focused on Samuel's face with an intensity that made the boy's breath catch in his throat. "You're just a child," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Each word seemed to cost him something precious, something he could ill afford to spend. "What are you doing out here alone?" "Tending sheep," Samuel replied, though the words felt inadequate. How could he explain the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders when his mother vanished? How could he describe the way silence had filled their small house like smoke, choking out conversation and laughter until only the essential remained? "My father's sheep." The soldier's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if pain hadn't twisted it into something else entirely. "Sheep," he repeated, as if the word held meaning beyond its simple definition. I had a son once. He wanted to be a shepherd," said the animals. They understood him better than people did. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. The man spoke of his son the way Samuel's father spoke of his mother, with the careful distance of someone describing a dream upon waking. "What happened to him?" "Apache raid, 5 years ago. Him and his mother both." The soldier's eyes closed, and for a moment Samuel thought he had lost him. But then the gray eyes opened again, and there was something fierce burning in their depths, something that refused to be extinguished by pain or loss. I've been hunting them ever since. The war party that took them, following rumors, chasing ghosts. But I found them. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I found them. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel felt the weight of them, the implications that stretched beyond this moment into territories he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. But there was something in the soldier's tone, something urgent and desperate, that made him lean closer. "What did you find?" Samuel asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. The soldier's hand moved slowly, painfully, to the top pocket of his torn uniform. His fingers, slick with blood, fumbled with the buttons until he managed to extract a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. He held it out to Samuel with trembling hands. "Take it," he whispered. "Look." Samuel unwrapped the cloth carefully, his young fingers working with the delicate precision he'd learned from handling newborn lambs. Inside was a tin-type photograph, cracked and yellowed with age. The image showed a woman and a young boy standing beside a wooden fence, the woman's hand resting on the boy's shoulder. But it was the woman's face that made Samuel's world tilt sideways, made his breath catch in his throat like a fishhook had lodged there. He knew that face, had dreamed of it every night for 3 years, had carried it in his memory like a sacred relic. The high cheekbones, the dark eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without words, the way she smiled that made it seem like she was keeping a wonderful secret. It was his mother's face, captured in silver and shadow. But the boy beside her was not Samuel. This child was perhaps a year younger, with darker hair and different eyes. But the resemblance was unmistakable in the set of his shoulders, in the way he held his head. "Where did you get this?" Samuel's voice came out as a croak, barely audible above the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The soldier's eyes fixed on Samuel's face, studying him with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and see straight into the boy's soul. "The Apache camp," he said slowly. "She was there, alive. Your mother, she's alive." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. The photograph trembled in his hands and he had to force himself to focus on the soldier's face, to anchor himself in the present moment before the enormity of what he just learned could sweep him away entirely. She had another son," Samuel whispered, more to himself than to the dying man. "She had another family." "Not by choice," the soldier said, his voice gaining strength from some hidden reserve. "They took her, boy, took her, and made her their prisoner. But she never forgot. She never stopped hoping." He reached out and touched Samuel's wrist with fingers that felt like ice. "She spoke of you, of her son back home. She made me promise. If I ever made it back, I would find you, tell you she's alive, tell you she's waiting." Samuel stared at the photograph, at the face of the woman who had been the center of his world until the day she vanished. The boy beside her looked well-fed, healthy, content. Not the face of a child born from violence, but of one who had found love even in the darkest circumstances. The thought should have brought him comfort, should have eased the knot of anger that had lived in his chest since his mother's disappearance. Instead, it filled him with a confusion so deep it felt like drowning. She's their mother too," he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "She loves him, this boy. I can see it in her eyes." The soldier's grip tightened on Samuel's wrist, and when the boy looked up, he saw understanding in the gray eyes. Not pity, but the recognition of one who had walked through the same fire and emerged forever changed. "Love doesn't divide, son. It multiplies. Your mother loving that boy, it doesn't make her love for you any less. It just means her heart had room for more." Samuel wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the simple wisdom of those words and let them wash away the bitter taste of betrayal that had risen in his throat. But 13 years of life had taught him that the world was rarely simple, that love could be as complicated as the trails the sheep wore through the desert, winding and treacherous and easy to lose if you didn't pay attention to where you were going. "How do I know she wants to come back?" The question escaped before he could stop it, carrying all the fear and doubt he'd carried for 3 years. "How do I know she didn't didn't choose to stay. The soldier's eyes closed, and for a moment Samuel thought he had pushed too hard, asked too much of a dying man. But then the gray eyes opened again, and there was something soft in them, something that reminded Samuel of the way his mother used to look at him when he was small and the world felt too big and frightening. "Because she gave me this," the soldier whispered, and his free hand moved to another pocket, this one over his heart. With painful slowness, he extracted a small wooden figure, roughly carved, but unmistakably a sheep. "She said you made it for her. Said you were always good with your hands, always making things. She carried it with her every day, boy, every single day." Samuel took the wooden sheep with trembling fingers. In the familiar weight of it transported him back 3 years to an evening by the fire when his mother had watched him carve it from a piece of pine. He'd been proud of the work, proud of the way he'd managed to capture the curve of the sheep's back, the gentle expression in its painted eyes. His mother had smiled when he'd given it to her, had kissed his forehead, and told him it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "She told me about that night," the soldier continued, his voice growing weaker with each word, "about how you stayed up past your bedtime to finish it, how you wanted to surprise her with something beautiful because she'd been sad about the drought, about the sheep you'd lost. She said, she said it was the moment she knew you were growing up to be a good man." Tears came then, hot and unexpected, spilling down Samuel's cheeks and dropping onto the wooden sheep in his hands. All the pain he'd carried, all the anger and confusion and desperate hope, came pouring out in great shuddering sobs that echoed off the red rocks around them. The soldier's hand found his shoulder, offering what comfort he could as Samuel wept for his mother, for the boy in the photograph, for the family that had been shattered and reformed in ways he was only beginning to understand. When the tears finally subsided, Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the soldier with new eyes. The man's face was gray now, waxy with approaching death, but his eyes remained clear and focused. "Tell me where," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. "Tell me where she is." The soldier smiled, and this time it was a real smile, untainted by pain or regret. "North of here, maybe 3 days' hard ride. There's a canyon with red walls shaped like a horseshoe. The Apache call it the place where the earth bleeds. Your mother, she's there, waiting." "Why didn't you bring her back?" Samuel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I tried," the soldier whispered, "but they saw me coming. I got close enough to see her, to give her the message that you were alive and well. But they knew I was there. I had to choose, fight my way out and die trying to take her with me, or live long enough to find you and tell you where she is." His eyes closed and his breathing became more labored. "I chose you, boy. I chose to bring you the truth." Samuel sat back on his heels, holding the wooden sheep in the photograph, feeling the weight of the choice that now lay before him. He was 13 years old, a boy who had learned to tend sheep and survive in the harsh desert. But he was not a warrior. He was not a man grown who could ride into Apache territory and demand the return of his mother. But he was also not the same boy who had woken up that morning, following his father's sheep to water. The truth had changed him, as truth always does, and there was no going back to the simple ignorance of an hour ago. "What do I do?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the dying soldier or to the vast sky above them. The soldier's eyes opened one last time, and there was something peaceful in them now, something that spoke of a burden finally lifted. "You do what your heart tells you to do," he said, "but remember, sometimes the bravest thing isn't charging into battle. Sometimes it's waiting. Sometimes it's growing strong enough to face what's coming." The words settled into Samuel's chest like seeds in fertile ground, and he felt something shift inside him, some fundamental change in the way he understood himself and his place in the world. He was no longer just a boy with a missing mother. He was a son with a choice to make, a future to shape, a love to honor in whatever way he could. The soldier's breathing grew shallow, and Samuel knew the end was near. He leaned closer, wanting to offer some comfort in these final moments, wanting to be the kind of presence his mother would have been if she were here. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Captain William Hayes," the soldier replied, his voice barely a whisper. "And you're Samuel Thorne, your mother. She talked about you all the time." Said you were her light in the darkness. Samuel felt fresh tears threaten, but he held them back. There would be time for tears later, time to mourn and plan and decide. For now he wanted to be present for this man who had given everything to bring him the truth. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for finding me." Captain Hayes smiled one last time, and then his eyes closed and his breathing stopped, and the desert reclaimed another soul. Samuel sat beside the body for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, listening to the distant bleating of his father's sheep. The wooden sheep sat warm in his palm, and the photograph lay beside him on the rock, two small pieces of evidence that his world had just become infinitely larger and more complicated. When he finally rose to his feet, Samuel was no longer the same boy who had followed a blood trail out of curiosity. He was someone new, someone who carried the weight of impossible choices and the burden of love that transcended the boundaries of family and tribe and the simple definitions of right and wrong. He looked north, toward the canyon where his mother waited, and felt the pull of that direction like a physical force. But he also thought of his father, alone in their small house, tending sheep and grieving for a woman he believed was dead. He thought of the boy in the photograph, who had known his mother's love for years while Samuel had lived with only her absence. He thought of the Apache camp, of the warriors who would not give up their captives without a fight, of the blood that would be spilled if he tried to claim what was his by right of birth. The sun was nearly overhead when Samuel finally gathered the photograph and the wooden sheep and began the long walk back to where his father's sheep waited. Each step felt like a decision, each breath like a prayer. Behind him, Captain Hayes lay still in the shadow of the red rocks, his mission complete, his promise kept. Ahead of him, Samuel could see the sheep moving slowly toward home, their woolly forms creating small clouds of dust in the desert air. He would tell his father what he had learned. He would share the burden of this knowledge and the weight of the choice that lay before them. But he would also keep the photograph and the wooden sheep close to his heart, tangible reminders that love was stronger than distance, that hope could survive even the harshest wilderness, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that led not to a destination, but to an understanding of who you were meant to become. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving and beautiful in its terrible honesty. Somewhere to the north, in a canyon shaped like a horseshoe, a woman waited for news of the son she had never stopped loving. Somewhere to the south, a man tended sheep and mourned for a wife he believed was lost forever. And here, in the space between hope and despair, between the known and the unknown, a 13-year-old boy walked toward home carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders and the promise of tomorrow in his heart. The sheep followed him, as they always had, trusting in his ability to lead them safely through the maze of desert trails and hidden dangers. But now Samuel understood that he was not just their shepherd. He was also a son, a brother to a boy he had never met, a keeper of secrets that could change everything or destroy it all. The wooden sheep in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the photograph pressed against his chest like a second skin. As the sun reached its zenith and the desert heat began to shimmer off the rocks, Samuel Thorne made his way home, carrying with him the dying words of a cavalry captain and the knowledge that love, like the desert itself, was vast and complicated and capable of sustaining life in the most unlikely places. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the love that had sustained him through 3 years of darkness. But today he was simply a boy, walking home with his father's sheep, holding the promise of his mother's return close to his heart, and trusting that the desert, in its infinite wisdom, would show him the way forward when the time came to choose. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.